All right, let's go ahead and get started. Our next talk is actually a panel discussion on HIPAA and privacy and InfoSec issues. We actually, at this moment, have the highest concentration of lawyers at ShowMeCon that you will probably see anywhere. I'm going to introduce our moderator for this panel, and I'll let him introduce the panelists. Hudson Harris, again, is an InfoSec lawyer just like me, although he keeps a higher percentage of his feet inside the lawyer world than I do. He is also a very talented wood furniture maker, but on the professional side, he's the Chief Revenue Officer at Adaptive America and Harris Logic, which is a healthcare technology company that builds big data solutions. And he also blogs for Tripwire and at his own blog, legallevity.com. So I'll turn it over to Hudson Harris.
No, Jeremy. I think Jeremy has it. Where's Jeremy? Hello, everybody. Cliff, thank you for the nice introduction. It's much better than Mr. Chronister's introductions, but... welcome, everybody. This is the HIPAA. Do we have a second mic? Hot mic. So this is the HIPAA panel for today. And some of you have seen I've given talks in the past on HIPAA at ShowMeCon. And this year, given some of the changes in the area and what's happening, I thought it'd be better to bring the four experts that I know best, including Dan Yarger, to come and give us a kind of a rundown of what they're facing and what they're dealing with right now. So starting immediately to my right is Dan Yarger. Most of you should know him. He works for Parameter, ethical hacker, manager of IT, information technologies, and part-time model. He focuses on HIPAA gap analysis and audits, and so he's going to bring a perspective of what happens when the whip is cracking. To his right is Dan Adams. He's privacy officer for Schnucks Markets, and he has been working over the past year or so to build that program within Schnucks. Next, we have Rebecca Romine. She is shareholder and counsel at Polsonelli Law Firm, focusing on HIPAA and privacy issues. And to her right, we have Elizabeth Vincenzo, which is senior counsel at Express Scripts. So as we begin, I'm going to let each speaker introduce and talk a little bit about what they are working on, but I want to make sure if anybody has questions, we have a microphone here. The best panels are those that are driven from the audience, so please ask questions, no matter how weird, please go ahead and ask. So I will start with you, Dan. What are you focusing on right now?
For us, on the audit side, it's always just about making sure that when we're doing audits that we're getting the appropriate questions asked and getting the answers so we can provide the best feedback to our clients for what they need.
So for me, it's working on the insider threat inside our pharmacies. I know where our data lives. I know the controls placed around it, but what I don't know is the employees, if their background check, if they're really clean or if they just haven't been caught yet. So working on exfiltration measures to where I can't stop somebody from taking a picture, but I can stop that 60,000 line spreadsheet from leaving the network. So that's what I'm working on right now.
I'm working on quite a few breaches, some involving ransomware, and then also quite a few OCR investigations, one resolution agreement, corrective action plan. So it's been interesting the last year and a half since OCR has gone a little bit crazy.
So we're always working on a lot of things. I think right now we're working on making sure that we're making our ransomware response plan very, very detailed, and that we know how to respond in a manner that quickly, and generally how it fits into our overall incident response plan. We're focusing on GDPR, which is the European, new European privacy law that goes into effect in May of next year. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
So, can everybody hear me okay if I don't talk to the microphone? All right. So, Elizabeth, starting with you, what are the biggest challenges you see coming in Express Scripts world or in your incident response projects over the next 6 months, kind of taking into account the ransomware that just happened? What are you really drilling into over the next 6 months?
Yeah, I think we're drilling into making sure we're kind of in the process of perfecting our incident response plan and making sure that it's very closely stitched together in terms of the different areas of the company and the responses. We have about 25,000 employees and over $1 billion in revenue, and we have a lot of different lines of business, and so it can be really hard to keep the consistency across the subsidiaries, across the business lines, in terms of making sure that everybody knows how they roll up into the highest level of the incident response plan.
How are you meeting together those various departments? How are you actually getting them to
Not very well. I think it's a combination of a commitment between our CISO, our chief data officer, our privacy officer, and legal. We're all those three people are my main customers that I spend a large majority of my time with, and we try really hard to have a consistent message amongst us, and to be working on things in parallel and know what the others are doing. So, yeah.
Excellent. Rebecca, you've worked on a couple different settlement cases and some more of on the good, the bad, and the ugly spectrum, more towards the ugly side of things. What are some of the recent challenges you've seen that have drawn the attention of OCR? Or the investigation heavy hand?
Okay, from an investigation heavy hand point, regardless of where an entity is in the process, if it's just responding to a data request, or OCR's decided that they're actually going to enter into a resolution agreement with an entity, I can't stress the risk analysis piece enough. So we're seeing still so many entities that don't really have a true enterprise-wide risk analysis that's been performed. I can't stress that it doesn't just mean a gap analysis, which oftentimes people rely upon, and you do need to be doing gap analyses. But OCR really is expecting to see inventories of where your electronic protected health information, where they are, where they're stored, how they're being transmitted. I know doing data mapping is a big undertaking for a lot of companies, and some companies choose not to do it, but if you have mapped your data, that is a really strong thing to be able to produce for them. And then also, oftentimes gap analyses kind of gloss over what are the specific risks and vulnerabilities that you're looking for, taking into consideration. And I think in here, intuitively, anyone could probably list off what those risks, vulnerabilities, and threats to security are, but without documenting them and really showing that you took them into consideration, and I think you'll preach on this later on, you didn't. So even if it may seem like it's common sense, really documenting what you considered, where you considered it as it relates to each type of asset that includes protected health information, that's what we're seeing OCR really look for, and quite a few entities fall down on it and not be able to produce sufficient documentation for.
Can I see a show of hands? How many people in here have participated in a risk analysis in your organization? That's better than it was last year. How many people in here participated in a data mapping or PHI life cycle type exercise in your organization? Okay. So we should get more hands up on the second question for next year, because it is something that's being focused on a whole lot. Rebecca, I have a question. You talked about the risk analysis. What are some of the key takeaways as far as outside of documentation that you're seeing really be focused on that organizations are missing?
Outside of risk analysis?
Yes.
Not having, if they've done the risk analysis, they should know this, but not having a good grasp on how various departments and systems talk to one another. We're seeing clients fall down on that, and particularly, luckily, in one of the recent ransomware incidents I was involved in, they actually knew their systems, and they discovered it and were able to isolate the attack very quickly. If they hadn't understood their kind of infrastructure and how servers were connected and how information was living in their environment, it could have been really bad. But because they understood that, and they knew that something was going on, they were really able to stop the event rather quickly. It never fully ran, which was awesome for them, and they were able to pull it and isolate it in kind of a sandbox environment to see what it would have done if they hadn't caught it, which from an OCR perspective and analyzing whether or not it needed to be reported or not, that was very positive because we were able to say, okay, this is what happened if we hadn't caught it and it had continued to run. This is what would have happened, and we know based on the test environment that data wouldn't have left the environment, and it really would have just sat there in an encrypted format. So that I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a big thing, really understanding how your systems are connected, which also goes to Elizabeth's point.
I also take away from that ethical hackers inside of your company are pretty valuable if that's what you're trying to do.
I agree with that.
So, Dan, you have a company that has a very large geographic footprint. This Dan. Not sexy Dan. Just Dan. Dan and Dan it. Okay. So, Dan, you're with a company that has a very large geographic footprint. How are you working to tie together 15,000 employees, the regulatory compliance, all of the different workflows and documentation that you're putting together? How are you pulling that into a place to get people on the same page?
So really the first thing that we worked from is finding a tool that's going to help us with our policy management. And from there, it's just been a flow down model we've been able to pull in every department into the tool and start disseminating policy to the people, and it also works with training. So we're deploying new training models against all stores in all pharmacies right now.
And how did you get corporate buy-in for something like that? What was that experience like in trying to get money spent towards something like compliance or a tool?
Threat of fines.
So the stick and not the carrot?
Whenever we're able to produce some type of documentation, the OCR breaches, whenever they find an organization, it's a good piece of evidence to have us build our program from.
Now it's your turn, Dan. So, Dan, you deal a lot with kind of cracking the whip on people and working with them on more of the audit side. What are your thoughts on what Rebecca said with regards to incident response? With Elizabeth regards to incident response, what Rebecca said to sandboxing things from an audit perspective. What does that show you as an auditor?
I mean, as an auditor, anytime you can show that you're exercising the plans that you have in place, that is critical. And I say that because if a lot of times we'll go on site and we'll be talking with people and we'll say, hey, and I'll just give this as an example. I'm like, do you guys have an incident response plan? Yes. Have you ever tested it? And, a lot of times we'll see people or customers that'll say, hey, yeah, we've tested it. We had a couple of incidents last year. We did this. And that's great. But are you running through all your scenarios? Are you running through, if it had gone further, are you taking it to that next step? Because I think it's really easy to be like, oh yeah, we tested our incident response and disaster recovery plan. The power went out last year. We documented it and we moved on. And that's great. You tested it, but did you test the things that could actually hurt you?
Or did you fix the things after they had happened that you identified?
Absolutely. And after you test the plan, having that post-mortem discussion and documenting that post-mortem discussion is also critical, because if you don't come to that far side and go, okay, this is where it didn't fell apart, this is where it didn't work, you're not going to get that continual improvement out of your plans.
So, show of hands, how many of you play games? Anybody play games? There should be everybody's hand in this room out of all conferences I go to should be playing games. Okay, so one thing that OCR has talked about and actually is in the regulations in some form or fashion are what are called tabletop exercises. So effectively D&D for HIPAA. So who here has done D&D for HIPAA with their organization, or done, ghost exercises, or what Dan talked about, tabletop? Is anybody? I see one, two cautious hands. Okay. And any of the panelists, if you guys had experience with tabletop exercises, can you share some of your thoughts on that?
So we do a full-blown tabletop exercise at least once a year with all of the relevant parties. We're talking about 100 people maybe, and go through a scenario and let it develop in real time as we would have to respond. I think it is a really great way to find out where your opportunities are and the things that you need to work on. I think it's the best way that we have for doing that, and teaches us a lot about the difference between what we have on paper and when something actually happens. Very big difference.
Is there a dungeon master that sits behind a cardboard thing and works out, or how does that actually play out in real life? Like, how does that work?
The exercise. So we sort of all gather, and we're presented with a scenario, and the different departments have, again, they're sort of, we have the big playbook, and then the sort of the department specific ones, and we sort of just take it through. Okay, like, what is going to happen? How's the incident identified? When is legal called? When do we, how do we figure out whether to privilege it? When we need to start thinking about our clients, because in the for our pharmacy benefit management business, we're the business associate. And so those covered entities that are upstream are, they want to know everything right away. So I think the other thing that is really important is establishing a narrative, like what is going on and who that needs to be communicated to, and thinking about that narrative for all your different audiences, from your employees to your clients, your vendors, your patients. All of those different people need to hear messages that are consistent, but also what the message for each of them needs to be what they need to hear, not just a generic overall message. So going back to how it plays out, we literally take it step by step, and new facts, we do an exercise where new facts are entered in as we go, and we sort of take it where it leads us, like choose your own adventure. We don't know what's going to happen, and I think that's a really good part of to our CISO's credit, a really good part of our exercise is you don't know in advance very much. So it's a very realistic type of scenario compared to, you get it. I've seen tabletops where you get it in advance and you sort of know everything and you're like ready to go. You have all your notes, and it's like staged out, which I think is not useful, but doing it in a more realistic way is much more helpful.
Did I see a hand? Was there a question? Yeah.
You hit on one of my main aspects that I see, not necessarily with HIPAA, but this with all organizations whenever they do DR, is they have kind of a set agenda, and you can't be kind of prepared, know who's going to speak for the company, what are they going to say, in order that their names aren't sitting in the on the newspaper somewhere and everybody knows what they're supposed to do. My problem is that normally when some of these things do happen, or when their exercises are taken, that's only one exercise. And so therefore, every 2 to 3 hours during your DR or your IR is to introduce a new problem, in order that the team is constantly have to affect what the first problem was, and now what the second problem is, and later on there's the third problem, and then there's the fourth problem, but they can't deal with them in silos. They have to deal with them at one time. It's one, then it's two things they're dealing with, three things they're dealing with, four things they're dealing with.
Right. New facts are revealed through your investigation. You don't know everything up front in a real situation, and so having your exercise mimic that reality of sort of the layers get peeled back over time, and not necessarily in a very, logical order, in terms of how you would like them to, and it's very messy, and I think it's really good to do it that way, because that real anxiety you start to feel, and you're like, oh God, it's pretty great.
There's a business model here for any young aspiring entrepreneurs. Create D&D for HIPAA. I think there's something here. Rebecca, did you have a thought on that?
So I tend to be the cleanup crew. So unfortunately, I don't generally get to be involved in terms of saying you should be doing this. It's oftentimes, well, did you do this? And the answer is no. Or sometimes almost worse is, did you do this? And the answer is yes. And we discovered that we're pretty weak in X, Y, and Z areas. And by the way, that was 3 years ago. And we haven't really done anything to address those 3 areas since. That's a really bad position to be in. It's really good that you did the table testing. It's really bad when it shows that there are weaknesses in a security program or in a process that need to be addressed, and they're kind of they're documented, but then no action is taken to address the situation. That's a bad scenario, and it's even worse when it's something that's pretty easy to fix. So that's my little nugget for that one.
Yeah, I was going to add with that. The other thing is, if you do go through the process of doing the exercises, make sure you actually document them. More than a few times I've sat in front of a client and they go, I'm like, did you guys test this? Oh yeah, we tested it. Did you document any of it? No, we thought it was good to go. Well, if you didn't document it, how can you prove you actually did it? And so from the audit side, from the gap analysis side, if you're not writing it down and you're not documenting that you did it, you might as well have just not done it.
We have somebody representing policy and procedure, so we do policy and procedure. Mm-hmm. Then we have somebody doing audit, and audit's looking at, let's see if there's any non-compliance. So being compliant and being secure are two different things.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so I get sometimes a little concerned that auditors tend to hide behind, we've checked all the boxes, but we haven't kept up because standards don't keep up with what the real issues are. And then we have the back end over here that says, hold on, OCR's coming in, our Office of Budget Management's coming in, regulatory's coming in, somebody's coming in saying, so is audit really doing its job of identifying issues and helping to make sure the issue doesn't reoccur? And is it because we want it done fast and cheap? Is it done because the standards are out of date? I'm not sure, but somehow audit's missing the boat, I feel.
Well, from my perspective, when we do audits as a third party, one of the big things that I always like to do is we'll sit down and I'll say, here's the standard, and password security is a great one to get into, because I think we can all kind of agree that for the most part, they'll be like, you need an 8-character password. That's great. We all know that's not enough. I think everybody in this room goes, yeah, that's not enough. So that's where, from our perspective, that's where we can step in and go, yes, you've met this standard, but really you need to be looking at this level over here. And from our perspective, that's where we always try to go beyond what just compliance is, because compliance alone is not security.
Dan, do you have any thoughts on what the role of audit should be towards this particular topic, or how you feel audit should be playing a role in your organization?
Well, I actually wanted to respond to earlier whenever he was talking about, security and compliance being two different things, where it kind of leads me back to a lot of companies do PCI, and they think since they have so many controls, they're secure after that. And that's one of the reasons I actually do love the HIPAA regulation. It's so vague with a severe amount of punishment that it really forces a company to start providing due diligence and due care for their customers. So I just want to actually jump in on that one.
Rebecca, any thoughts?
I don't have any thoughts really kind of specific to the issue, but since we've been talking a little about documentation and audits, one thing I think sometimes there's a fine balance to strike within your documentation. You obviously need documentation to show that you've been doing something. One thing that we've really started recommending to clients and to outside companies that we work with is, having all of the details is important, but putting all of the details into a summary report that you may end up having to produce to the government at some point can sometimes hurt you. An example of that is, I was just going through a summary report of a gap analysis, and this particular entity, their security awareness training was only about 65% of their workforce had completed training, that's not a very good fact. And so knowing that this is something that we may be providing to the government, I don't want to tell them how out of compliance we were. I want to know we reviewed our security awareness training. Not all employees were trained, period. Internally, it needs to be noted how out of compliance you were, but there needs to be a document that kind of summarizes, hits the important points, but is also something that you're going to be comfortable with letting outside of your organization into an enforcement agency's hands.
Yeah, I would say, as from our perspective, is when we go through these things, and we always start with, hey, this is where it is, but we'll include recommendations that exceed HIPAA regulations on the backside in a separate report, because we don't want to get into a situation where I was like, hey, you should really go to 16-character passwords, and they go, well, why didn't you? Yeah.
He's the type of auditor we like to work with.
So I've got a question in terms of HIPAA. We're going through high trust right now. So check the box audits are like old and to me really outdated, and they don't do justice for anybody, and there's not enough due diligence involved. Are anybody on the panel here, and I know Dan, are you guys going through high trust discussions with clients, or how you're dealing with it? Because high trust is a game changer. And there's 300 plus controls that we're dealing with, and for gaps that we had and that we thought we were addressing properly, we weren't addressing properly, and it's really changing the whole world of HIPAA, and I think everybody needs to be high trust accredited.
So, we're high trust certified, and our CISO is very committed to it. I think that from my point of view as the privacy and data attorney, I think that I see where being high trust certified can make people a little too complacent because they're not thinking about HIPAA itself, which is different. And but I think it's very important, and we consider it a very important certification. We ask vendors for it. We don't get it as much as we want to, but we certainly follow it, and definitely think that it's an amazing standard for us to live up to.
Elizabeth just said something that I think is important, and it has less to do with security and compliance. But another thing that I do in practice is I do a lot of vendor contracting in the negotiations. And we are seeing a lot of, kind of on both sides, on a healthcare provider side, requiring vendors to be high trust certified. And so regardless of what you think of the standard, if that's kind of where the industry is going from a business perspective, you may not have a choice. So that's kind of the first point. On the opposite side, when it comes to the vendors, we've seen a lot of vendors use it to their advantage in terms of saying, hey, and I pick on the healthcare providers because they're easiest to pick on. Hey, healthcare provider, we're high trust certified, so all of these other contractual terms that you're requesting us to agree to, from, a liability perspective, from us providing you with information related to our security program, that's really not necessary. We'll just give you a representation that we're HITRUST certified, and will remain certified. So outside of kind of whether or not the standards are good and it improves security, I'm seeing a lot of business advantages on both ends for HITRUST certification.
And one of the good things is HITRUST is built off of NIST. It crosswalks pretty easy. So if you've been following the NIST framework pretty well, then you're pretty set up to start adopting HITRUST. We're going down that path right now because PBMs are going to start requiring even pharmacies, pharmacy retail locations to be HITRUST certified. He's got nothing.
So I just want to add back to your, and I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. So I agree. We have a HIPAA for IT and security protecting the data. Just as a quick follow-up,
Yeah.
There's definitely a difference that maybe isn't fully being addressed. Like we have a HIPAA privacy officer that deals with that whole paper world side of HIPAA. There's a gap for that, but for us, HITRUST is clearly meeting the data and everything on the HIPAA security rule that my boss, our security officer for HIPAA, addresses. So I see a gap difference there, I guess, from the privacy side versus the security rule side.
So I'm a senior security engineer for IBM in their Watson division, and we obviously have a lot of HIPAA stuff going on. But I'm on the technical side of monitoring all of our REL systems for whatever. I'm going to defend Dan, the auditor, here from a technical perspective, and just to go back to this gentleman's comment earlier that it's not audit's fault. My ultimate question is, and one of my complaints for the last 4 years has been, what is being taken back to try to change or update or improve the HIPAA rules and HIPAA laws? Because from a technical standpoint, when I get on a box to secure it, and I see other industry best practices that are way, way above where the required technical controls are for HIPAA and even PCI. The password thing is a prime example. And I can only talk about it from a server administration perspective, not necessarily end users. But when I see things like for administrators that have full privilege access to systems that contain PHI and other HIPAA data, and their character or password requirements are only 8 characters instead of 16, or we're not requiring two-factor authentication for those types of folks, that to me is a massive rule problem and law problem. It's not an audit or a compliance problem. That is saying we need to fix the policy itself or the regulation itself.
Dan doesn't need any help. He can defend himself.
Thank you.
To that point, I'd like to just say, I think one of the mistakes that I see people making is seeing HIPAA as something to the regs as something to aspire to, and the requirements. That's a floor. I mean, that's where you start. And so, to your point about the passwords, anybody can do the minimum, and of course you should be doing but that it is the minimum. And so aspiring to those additional protections we should all want that.
So question for Hudson, and the panel can weigh in as well. I'm wondering, as organizations mature their HIPAA program and their HIPAA security, and obviously they're fearful and they're trying to do their best job to be prepared for that ever-looming OCR audit to come in. I have heard, and I'm wondering if there's some truth in this or not, but I have heard that maybe one of the differences in contrast to PCI is if you do get that OCR audit, and even though while maybe you're not meeting all the controls in the HIPAA framework, when the auditor comes in, they do give you a bit of forgiveness if you can provide them some sort of, here's what we're doing to work towards that. Here's our in 6 months we intend to be here, in 12 months we intend to be here. Is that true, where they give you some forgiveness, or is it like, sorry, you're not there yet, here's your fine?
That's true. That's true. It really depends on what brought them in your door in the first place. There's several ways the OCR may come in your door. They have their audit program. Their on-site audits are currently on hold, so no one should have to worry about being visited on-site right now, which is good. With the audit program, they really touted that it was truly we're trying to get a good idea of what entities are facing, and where there may be some issues with compliance, and they basically tried to bill it as, we're providing free consulting services. We're going to review your practices and give you some recommendations. I haven't heard of anyone that went through a desktop audit that has been subject to fines, so that's good news. Where, the other ways that they may come in is if you've had a big breach. They are actually investigating all breaches that are reported that involve over 500 people. So that's one way. The other way is, I have two of these right now. They are doing general compliance reviews, and those aren't being triggered by over 500 breach reports. They're OCR, each of their regions, I guess, was told they need to do a certain number of these. And so they're looking at, whether an entity's reported similar under 500 breaches over a period of time, whether there's certain trends that they're seeing through those reports, whether they're getting complaints from individuals related to certain practices. And a consumer complaint is another way. Just one consumer complaint can result in an investigation letter. So in those instances, they are investigating, and you do have to provide documentation, but I have found that they are pretty understanding if they ask for something and you say, we realize we do not have the documentation to respond, but since receiving your letter, we have started to undertake this process, or we've hired this company to come in and do a risk analysis for us. When that is done, we will provide the appropriate documentation to you. They are generally pretty understanding about that, unless it's an entity that has had a past history of compliance issues, or, and this is why I brought up if you find an issue, you should address it, or if something in your documentation that you are able to provide leads them to believe that you've known about issues and just avoided addressing them. I think I meet 70 resolution agreements now or something like that, around that number. There are a lot more investigations and documentation requests that are happening and people are having to respond to than are actually resulting in fines. I think lately some of the fines have been kind of example cases. For instance, there was a $30,000 fine against a smaller practice for not having a business associate agreement in place. That's really low-hanging fruit and easy for OCR. You either have it or you don't. But to the rest of the country, that was a signal of, okay, this is something that OCR is really going to start focusing on. We need to start looking at our practices to make sure that we're in compliance. So we've really told clients to use recent settlements as a roadmap as to the next thing that they should be paying attention to.
Literally the only listserv I subscribe to from the government is from OCR Privacy and OCR Security, so that I get a notice when those settlements come down. Like, it's absolutely critical. Short little blurt emails, but then this just happened, and it's coming in. Jiba?
I think it's important to I mean, the audit protocols are out there. That's on the OCR website. You should test yourself against those. You should be ready. You should have everything ready to go, because when that desk audit comes, you have 10 days, right? You have 10 days to produce that information. You want to be ready. You do not want to be scrambling, and then that will help you avoid that gap. Oh, we don't have that. That's not the time you want to be figuring out that you're missing something.
And Joey, to your point, when they announced the desk audits was at the beginning of this year, I had 4 entities that I work with get notice that we were in the pool, and then we had 6 months to get our documentation together. So they do reward the work you put in, but it's like they say, if you're on notice or something's wrong, you need to do something about it.
I have two more thoughts related to that too. The first is if OCR has been pretty generous if you get formally contacted outside of the audit program for a document request. They have been pretty generous in giving time extensions. So that generally gives companies a little bit more time if they don't have appropriate documentation to kind of come up with an action plan to really identify, look, this is where we're not going to lie to OCR, but we're going to say we didn't have something in place, but this is what we've worked to get in place. The second thought, and this, I haven't had personal experience with this, but I have a colleague who is a former OCR investigator. When it comes to whether or not you end up with a fine or resolution agreement, oftentimes those that play nice and are nice to work with, from the OCR investigator standpoint, that goes a long way. Trying to argue with the investigator that their request for documents was inappropriate, that it was outside the scope, that what you've provided shouldn't have, or what they've asked for shouldn't have to be provided, what they've asked for is stupid. That's not a good idea. Or if you don't have something, kind of getting backed in the corner and saying, well, but we're in full compliance and, trying to promote every other area where you may be stronger. That doesn't work, and so it's better to take the approach, and I know this isn't often the case with an enforcement agency, but to listen and to work with them versus kind of going in that defensive adversarial mode.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and this comes from the auditing side of what I do. A lot of people that I see end up, we're having interviews. They're trying to appease the assessor, and I'm not from the OCR, and so they're trying to tell me what I want to hear or what they think I want to hear, as opposed to tell me what's actually going on. And at the end of the day, the only person person gets hurt from that is the organization itself, because I can go in and you can get a great audit from me and it says, yeah, we're doing all these things, but when the OCR comes in and says, hey, I need you to actually give me every piece of documentation that goes with this, and you don't have any of it, it doesn't really matter that you told me that you had it.
There's a question in the back.
Yes, hello, my name is Matthew Maynard. I'm an IT security analyst, and I believe I have the best job in the world. I love working with people. I'm also in the healthcare industry. And the question that I have pertains to, I know we've been talking about policies, documents, checks boxes, and making sure we're all compliant. And one of the factors that I've noticed more and more common every day is the lack of knowledge, not necessarily that people are dumb, but whenever it comes to employees, a lot of people, when it comes to HIPAA compliant, are actually don't really understand it, or actually don't understand what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. People will take PHI, put it on a flash drive. People will do take a patient chart, put it in Google Docs, or they'll take it and they'll put it in Dropbox, and then it just continues. And then usually when it's addressed with that type of person, they'll just like, well, I didn't know. I wasn't sure I was supposed to do this. And the list goes on and on from there. So like we could put all our, devices, we could do all our policies and everything else and put them in place, but we all know it just takes one person to end up making a mistake to cost, basically the lives of millions of people, and all their data is compromised. But basically, just on a brighter note, when we educate our employees, we try and teach them more and more about what we're supposed to follow, that these are our policies, these are government regulations, and they're designed to, help people. They may be hard at times to follow and stuff, but, let's face it, we got to do something. We just can't just let all this transpire and us not do anything. But I guess the question isn't just a moral overview, is what type of steps can a healthcare industry or type of company do to basically train up the employees, let them know it's like, well, this is what we're doing and this is why. What type of security awareness training are you basically experienced that have a pretty good successful rate with their employees? So that way, when you show them that that's what's going on, and basically what they're learning isn't going to dry them out, they're not going to get it, basically just when they leave, they're going to go, okay, I understand this now. This is why I can't do these things, and this is why you're doing your job to keep everybody safe.
So what I would say, I don't know whether you were in here this morning for our panel discussion on Trojans this morning, but one of the things as an organization I see is training. And a lot of organizations will blanket put training out and say, hey, everybody in the organization is taking this training because it meets our requirements for security awareness. I think a lot of organizations need to take a step back and go, let's give people the training that they actually need for the jobs that they're performing. Just to give you an idea, if you have somebody who's dealing with one record at a time, they need a certain amount of training. If you have a database administrator who's dealing with millions of records at a time, he needs to have different training. One size does not fit all when it comes to training.
Yeah, so user awareness, security awareness is probably one of the toughest things to accomplish, especially whenever you have a high turnover rate. Across 100 stores, you're going to have new employees every day. I kind of look back to whenever I was in the military. They had some very interesting interactive computer-based training that you had to accomplish yearly. That's what I'm kind of wanting to move more towards, is something interactive rather than a death by PowerPoint or read this policy. But just having that ability to touch each one of your users is probably the most important.
I know Hudson has this thought because I think I heard him speak about it once. But oftentimes, organizations may do, hour and a half, hour long computer trainings where someone's sitting, clicking the mouse, probably surfing the internet at the same time, or they may be in a room zoned out or looking at their phone. I think that's just a checkbox type of training. You say we've done it and it's really not effective. People don't pay attention for that period of time. And so I think where we've seen clients have more success with doing security training is where they do it by topic. It may be a 15-minute or a 5-minute, hey, watch this video and learn about this one discrete area. And you may have 20 videos that you need to watch over a 6-month period, but that 5 minutes has a lot more impact on the individual than sitting in an hour-long session. So I think that's an effective way. Also sending I don't want to say newsletters, but alerts to employees if something's happened, to reminders, hey, this happened. As a reminder, X, Y, and Z. That's effective because it brings it back to, one, we experienced something, and so it makes it more of a real threat. And two, I'm more likely to remember a 2-sentence reminder than I am, a 1-hour session that I zoned out in.
Yeah. So I totally agree with Dan's comments about role-based training. Everybody needs a baseline, but your roles are very, very different. And like the other Dan, I have an organization with a lot of turnover just because it's a lot of employees, and so it can be really hard. So one of the things that we think about with training particularly is first of all, making it interesting, making it interactive, making it mandatory. So there's no, we had 90% of the people, yay. By the end of the training period, we have 100% of our 27,000 employees every time. That is our goal. We reach that goal every time. And so that's not easy. That's a lot of nagging. But the other thing I would say is that one of the things that we've been doing is people can take training and they can be quizzed and pass the quizzes, but you give them a real life test, you send them an email that's phishing, you see what happens. It's harsh. It's, that is something that, you can think you, as an employee, you know everything and you're ready to go and you're watching for it. And those, my 200 emails a day, I'm not paying, that's not necessarily springing to mind. And when I miss it and then I'm told that I've missed it, I'm not, and we don't punish people for it, but we say, okay, here you go. And it's a big eye opener for people, really big. Right. And we focus on trying not to punish people in learning experiences, but to make it stick.
We have time for one quick question. That's very good. I have one other question in the back before we wrap up.
Yeah, so we do our internal HIPAA security rule audits, and I think it was previously mentioned that the HIPAA rules are pretty general, almost vague and all that. So we do the best our interpretation of how the rule is and do our analysis, documentation, and all that. But we've always had the concern that maybe an OCR auditor would come in, have a lot stricter interpretation than we're doing it. So it's just kind of a general question. Do you see like OCR auditors, are they generally satisfied as long as you analyzed it, documented, tracked their gaps, or do they really go after you if they have a stricter interpretation of a rule?
I'm a big fan of A for effort when it comes to OCR auditors, and the way to find out what effort, in my opinion, is to go look at the settlement and resolution agreements. You will see what they consider good effort there. I mean, they are not obtuse or opaque when it comes to what they think is the right thing to do. And even to a point a year and a half ago, I asked a question at the HIPAA Summit of whether ransomware was a breach, and 6 months later they released a white paper on, hey, ransomware is actually a breach. So they're very open. You can even call and talk to people sometimes, and so ask anonymously, but ask. Any other thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
Yeah, just to bank on that, the security rule, it's kind of funny. In there it will tell you you're supposed to report to OCR each successful and unsuccessful attempt on your system. But what OCR is not going to care about is a port scan on your machine. So a lot of it is a judgment call on what you do. But as long as you're doing your best effort, usually they're pretty forgiving as long as you're living in the confines of the rule.
I haven't seen OCR really, when it comes to them making an assessment about your program, I haven't seen, what they care about is that you're doing something and you've documented it. I haven't or if you've identified a vulnerability that you have addressed the situation. I haven't seen them come in and say, well, we don't think you have strong enough controls related to X, Y, and Z, which may be industry standard. So I don't know if that helps address kind of your question. They really are looking to make sure that you are following the baseline regulations, and not maybe what has become industry standard.
Any parting comments?
Sure. I just want to reiterate something this gentleman said. We can do all the training and awareness that we want, but when you have an enormous workforce that naturally has a lot of turnover, the other thing is make things foolproof. Don't, like you said, don't let them use, external storage devices. Lock that down. People will get used to it. If it's their job and you're requiring it, they will get used to it, and it will save you a lot of heartache.
I have like 2 seconds to say this, but I think the biggest takeaway is that security programs and your documentation, it needs to be a dynamic process. Everything continues to change. Your systems continue to change. The threats to your systems continue to change. And so having stale programs is also kind of a big area of risk and something that needs to be paid attention to.
Yeah, so if I had anything for parting, it's do a gap analysis, risk analysis, and then formulate a corrective action plan on paper. Because if you have that, then OCR, if they do come in, you're good.
I guess the best thing I could say is if you say you're doing it, make sure you're documenting it, and then make sure you're documenting that you're documenting. No, I'm kidding. But make sure you're documenting it, and make sure you have a process to audit that the documentation is working and that your process is working. And then if you're not meeting the requirement, make sure you're documenting that you know you're not making the requirement, and that how you're working to actually get there.
Your wedding vows must have been really exciting.
What?
Your wedding vows must have been very exciting.
Thorough.
Yeah.
I saw an organization struggle with this. If you have a risk analysis, don't make just one master document your risk analysis. It's a living and breathing document. I've seen several organizations that have like one master document and they keep making changes to it. And so if an investigator comes in and says, we'd like to see your risk analysis that was in place at the time that this event a year ago happened, please produce it. They have nothing to produce because that document, it wasn't archived in versions. It was just, it's been modified on a continuous basis. So not only is documentation